Well, folks, I asked you to share your most liked and disliked Stormwind cards, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the ones you guys hated the most. And specifically, I asked you to focus on cards whose mechanics or functions you thought were poorly designed. So this is less about sort of flavor or feel, more about the functional side of cards. And yeah, we're going to run through the 10 most hated, least liked, whatever you want to call it, designs from Stormwind. Starting off here with number 10. This one shocked me just because I didn't really think anybody would think of it. Auctioneer Jackson, your 10th most hated Stormwind design. And I get it. You know, there's nothing harmful about this one. It certainly hasn't ruined the meta or anything. But it is a very low power legendary. And I think a lot of people were looking for something different as a trade support card, tradable support card. We've got some awesome tradable cards in the expansion. It seems to be a very popular keyword based on people who like cards. Tradable showed up a ton. So, you know, using this as a way to sort of support or complement the tradable keyword success, Jackson definitely feels disappointing in that way. Now, for me, I actually think this design's okay. It's probably just a power level issue for this one where you've got a cool keyword and it's, you know, it's centerpiece legendary, which this doesn't feel like, but it could have been. It doesn't live up to the expectations of the keyword, then that feels bad. So a lot of people have proposed various redesigns for this one that they think would feel a little bit better. But for me, you know, I think there's some elegance to it. It's just a power level issue. Maybe it needed to be cheaper. Maybe it needed to include some sort of cost discount. Maybe there's just not the right deck that's really looking for very specific sorts of cards off of tradable that's happy to pay this 2-mana tax. But all in all, I think it's a totally fine card. I'm surprised this one actually showed up on the list at all. So moving on here, we've got Seek Guidance at the number 9 spot. And I thought this was a really cool one to see. I thought when I asked you guys for card designs you disliked, it would just be like, you know, the kind of meta dominant cards that you're sick of seeing. But, you know, Seek Guidance has not been a meta dominant card, but still a lot of you had the maturity and grace to recognize that it might have some design issues. Specifically, I think people just think it's kind of boring from a quest execution standpoint. It's literally just about playing on curve. And then on top of that, the reward is just universal in that it just straight up defeats your opponent. So it feels, you know, in some ways just like the most obvious quest design and the most just insta-win, which are two things people kind of hate. So even though the power level isn't quite there for Seek Guidance, I do understand why the design simplicity still feels frustrating to people. And this is one of those cards where if the meta ever opens up enough for it to be good and it becomes a meta-relevant card and something you see fairly often, this is going to quickly jump, I'd say, to the top of the list for most hated cards, because I think people will often sort of feel helpless while the opponent moves towards the shard that just insta-snipes them. All right, so next up here is the Rat King, and this was another surprise, but this one comes down to actual in-game functionality. I think a lot of people love the design of Rat King as far as like the effects and the stats and the class and all that stuff, because it's going to show up, spoiler alert, on the most liked cards video. But there's a problem with Rat King's animations, specifically in-game, where he takes forever to revive himself. Especially if you have multiple Rat Kings on board and you're trying to do some shenanigans with, you know, resummoning and trading in a bunch of Rat Kings. Takes forever, like unplayably long when you're trying to pull off those cool turns. And that's clearly what has been captured here in the data for the Rat King. People just don't like that the in-game functionality is reduced so much by animation times, which is definitely a relevant concern and a reason for a card to show up on this list. Now, Blizzard said they tidied it up. I haven't really experienced the Rat King since they tightened up the animations. Maybe it's less problematic now, but it goes a long way to show that there's a ton of opportunity for this card, and just small challenges when trying to execute a card can make it go from a loved card to a hated card rather quickly. So moving on here to Runed Mithril Rod for Warlock, and moving forward, we're going to kind of get those meta-dominant cards that people start to hate. And I get it for Rune Mithril Rod. It's just hyper efficient cost reduction. A lot of the other cost reduction cards we got in Stormwind are also sort of frustrating and problematic, but in some ways they were limited. Like, you know, if you think about Demon Hunter Quest, it's just affecting the cards you draw. If you think about the Shaman Elemental discount guy Forgeborn dude. He's only elementals, which still actually pretty insane. I think he deserved to be on this list, but spoiler alert, he's not. But Rune Mythril Rod's affecting your entire hand. It doesn't require any like real sacrifices because it's just encouraging and reinforcing the things that the deck want to do already. Like Warlock wants to draw a ton of cards. They have cards that benefit from drawing a ton of cards. This card benefits drawing a ton of cards. So there's no sort of counterbalancing to this. It just does what you want it to do, and it does it hyper efficiently, and then you just become an absolute powerhouse in the mid game, and that's why Quest Warlock has been such a force to reckon with in this meta, and why, of course, Rune Mythril Rod got nerfed. Remember, this was a 3-mana card, not a 4-mana card as it stands today. And I think the fact that it's just so synergistic, there's no compromises made with Rune Mythril Rod are the two things that made it so frustrating for people. So next up, another shocker here, I guess, a Nephron. It took me a minute to remember why this one's here, because Nephron has been a pseudo-meta relevant card. He's popped into some of the more hand-driven Quest Warlock decks that have been very prominent this meta, but he's more of a rare inclusion. He's not that common, not really being run much today. I guess he did peak at 10% inclusion in the meta, which is pretty darn high. So I still don't think, though, his like actual gameplay experience or moments in game or why people are so frustrated by Nephron. I think it's the fact that he's this big story relevant legendary. The whole Stormwind story is about Tamsin summoning a Nephron and Kurtrus fighting a Nephron and all this stuff. And his effect is really, really simplistic, and his stats are kind of underwhelming and, dare I say, boring. So I think the reason the design on this card is so frustrating for people is because it's a little bit too much of a contrast between his presumed importance and his actual in-game effect. So next up here is Garrote, Garrote, however you want to say this one. I think the reason it's on this list is because no one knows how to pronounce the word. And here's where 47 people in chat are all going to respond with different correct pronunciations. Listen, I think it's Garrote. We're going to be specific, but we'll call it Garrote because that's what most people call it. So anyway, Garrote's on here, maybe in part because of its name, but also I think Garrote Rogue is a pretty frustrating deck to play against. They just go crazy, and you're dead. And it doesn't feel like there's much time in between. Now, of course, it's not the strongest deck. You do have time to get under it if you're playing a more aggressive deck, but sometimes it can feel helpless. Once they start popping off with Garrote stuff and they just bleed you to death, that's a tough way to lose, right? People don't like to go from 30 to 0 in a single turn when they're just kind of watching it unfold. And that's what Garrote's good at. That's what Garrote OTK does. So I'm sure this has created some bad experiences and moments for lots of players. Those are top of mind. So a card like this, not a surprise at all for me to see on this list. Garrote. Next up here is Battleground Battlemaster. And yeah, this is just too strong of a finisher for a neutral card, right? This really dominated the early part of the Stormwind meta. It's just too reliable of a finisher. I guess most prominently in some of the handlocky or warlock stuff, and of course hand buff paladin early on as well. We're both utilizing Battleground Battlemaster to great success. And the crazy thing is, this card still gets played today, even after going to 6 mana. Like, that's pretty impressive. It certainly lost a little bit of ground, but it's still in over 10% of decks, despite being nerfed an entire mana, because it's still just such an insane finisher. It presents this threat where if your opponent leaves anything on board, they might just be dead thanks to Battleground Battlemaster. On top of that, it's a neutral card, so it can go across a ton of decks. And I think one of the most frustrating aspects was it had really good stats. Like, for such a strong onboard effect, you expect your opponent to kind of sacrifice stats along the way. Even though the stats don't really matter, it often just ended games. It's just sort of more of an insult that they did this thing that won the game. And they got to play a pretty reasonably statted minion on curve as well when this was 5 mana. So I don't know. It's probably just the fact that you lose so many games why this is here. And I get that. It has been very strong, too strong indeed. But I feel like the stats were an insult as well. I think some people cite the rollover effect of this as well, how it's not like a battle cry. There's some upside and downside to that, right? Because if you can kill the Battlemaster, that removes the Wind Fury effect. If it's a battle cry, it might be harder to kill the minion with Battle Cry in some cases. So I've heard that be a reason people are mad about this card too, which is fair, but you know, there's downsides to it kind of either way you design it. But all in all, just way too strong, way too good for a neutral finisher, and certainly a deserving card to be on this list. This was in my top 3 most disliked cards as well. Next up here is Ignite, and yeah, this is in a lot of ways, I think this is a cool design, you know, this sort of infinite resource Ignite. I like the idea of that in theory, but, you know, it's been warped by 2 things, I think. The fact that it scales, it keeps getting bigger and bigger over time. I don't really think that's a necessary aspect of the card. And then, of course, Quest Mage has just been so popular on ladder and was initially so good on ladder that Ignite ended so many games. You know, these like crazy cram session into Ignite draws where these things are dealing 7, 8, 9, 10 damage for only 2 mana. People see that over and over again, you're going to start to hate a card, and it just feels like you can't win because the mage never runs out of damage. The Ignites just keep coming back. So even if you have 80 health and you feel like you're going to stabilize, nope, Ignite still beats you. Sorry, bro. And of course, that denies people who want to play like grindy or attrition style control decks with a bunch of healing and armor gain. Doesn't matter, Ignite still wins. So a lot of players are frustrated because it feels like Ignite removes sort of an entire archetype or style of play from Hearthstone. All right, so next up here is our final 2. You'll never guess. I'm honestly just going to bundle them together. It's the Demonseed at number 1 and Sorcerer's Gambit at number 2. The 2 quests that most warped the meta, really, for United and Stormwind. And then the Demonseed as the real standout because it totally ruined Wild format in most players' eyes, from what I've heard. I didn't play Wild a lot myself, but that's what everybody seemed to say. So both insane and standard, and then Demonseed took the number 1 spot by a pretty significant margin, probably because of Wild players speaking up. Has since been banned in Wild. So there you go. That's solved. Still, each of them very popular decks in standard at varying levels of success depending on your rank and stuff, but both frustrating to lose to because they have that inevitability built into them. They're just game-altering effects that once they're complete feel unbeatable. I mean, Warlock's just going to murder you with like fatigue damage eventually, or just whatever crazy stuff they can do from hand. And then Mage, same story, right? Ignites are inevitable, and they just can deal crazy damage from hand before then. So you just don't feel like you have a chance to win once they enact their game plan, and doesn't feel like you can disrupt or interrupt that game plan much either, unless you just really race them down with face damage. So, you know, that's why they've warped the meta around them. It feels like you have to play hyper aggressive or just OTK them before they get a chance to OTK you. So the linear styles of gameplay, some people don't like it, and that's why they speak out in these sorts of surveys, and sure enough, these take the top 2 spots. But yeah, these are probably the most discussed and most disliked cards I've ever actually seen in Hearthstone. Maybe like Shutterwalk was in that category for a while there, but yeah, these are some of the most hated cards, not just in Stormwind, but ever. And there you go. Yeah, so these are the most disliked cards from United in Stormwind. Some surprises, sure, but some pretty obvious ones as well, as far as I'm concerned. And stay tuned. In the next few days, we'll do the most liked cards in Stormwind as well. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in Stormwind that has gotten a little play, but has an opportunity to be really fun. So, you know, we want to take the good with the bad and vice versa. So we'll talk about those and try to emphasize some of the opportunities that exist that Stormwind or mini sets or future metas might be able to open up and give us some cool moments for. So share your thoughts on these cards. What ones were you surprised were here? What ones were you surprised weren't on this list? I thought like Granite Forgeborn would be here for Shaman. That's one I would have included. Probably the only one of my top 5 that wasn't here. I think it's just like, you know, nothing like crazy about Granite Forgeborn, but it's just a little obvious and simple. And it feels like one of those cards where they just said, hey, let's push Elemental Shaman, and just made this thing that just really pushed Elemental Shaman. So, you know, less crazy in its design, but still sort of not exactly elegant. So anyway, that's one of mine, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. Thanks as always for watching. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on all these cards. And until next time, game on.